Good morning. My name is Jared Morrison, and I'm an organization development consultant for the Learning and Organizational Development Unit here with OSU Extension. I'm excited to welcome you in this morning for our ACEL 2 Extension series. That is a wonderful collaboration between our Department of Agricultural Communication, Education, and Leadership. We've been doing this now. This is into our third year for this, and it's been a wonderful partnership. Heard great things both from the ACEL faculty that have been involved in teaching, as well as from all of you, our extension staff and faculty who have been participating in these sessions. So thank you all for joining us. For today, we will be welcoming in Dr. Jeff King, who will be our presenter this morning. And Jeff, we appreciate your continued support. Know that you've done at least one of these every series and are always happy to help us out in extension with a variety of things. So we do appreciate that. And today's topic will be dealing with difficult people. So Jeff, if you're ready, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, let me share my screen. And Jared, can you see the screen? For some reason, it didn't feel like.
It is not up yet.
Okay, I'll try it again.
There it is.
Yep.
Okay, so today the topic is dealing with difficult people. And as I think about the timeline that we have this morning, the hour period, what are things that we can really leave you with that you could potentially begin to integrate and use as you encounter difficult people at work, in the community, or sometimes maybe even at home. But this whole idea is to gain some insights. What I'm going to use today, I don't know if any of you have ever had the chance to read Working With You Is Killing Me. Working With You Is Killing Me. And I'm going to use this as the framework, or a section of this as a framework on how do we begin to work with people. And the reason for that is, or difficult people, is this gives you really a framework and a structure to move forward. Many times when we talk about difficult people, there's also elements of conflict and conflict management. And I've done several workshops on that, and several of you have also been a part of those. So I want to take a little bit different look at it, but yet incorporate some of those things. So as we begin gaining insights and strategies, I also like to begin with what I call the results cone. And the results cone here that some of you may have seen, I know I've had a couple of you in class, so you are familiar with the results cone, but we get our results from what? We get our results from our behaviors. So what begins to drive our behaviors? It's really elements of our thinking. So as we look at gaining insights and we look at strategies, strategies alone or a behavior are not enough, I don't think, for us to be the most effective. So it's that idea, how do we put our thinking behind those strategies and they work together? Because I don't think it's independent. And when we understand why we might approach something in a certain way with a difficult person, gosh, even if your emotion says, I don't want to talk to them, we have to take that step back and better understand why do we need to change how we show up. Because whose behavior do we have control over? Gosh, we only have control over our own behavior. We can't control that difficult person, but we can begin to influence that difficult person by how we show up to conversations. How we show up to conversations, and it's also our thinking about it and our behaviors. And the text there in Working With You Is Killing Me talks about, are you hooked? Do you feel caught in that emotionally distressing situation when you think of that person, see that person, or have to sit down and talk with them, and often constantly having negative interactions with somebody or something? It's just that continual picking away at the individual and feeling like you're caught. So what does it look like? Just take a moment and look through those characteristics there. When you see that person, you begin to engage with that individual or individuals. Do you see some of these coming through? Oftentimes for me, it's that tension headache, kind of just thinking about it. The emotional side can pick up several of those. Probably the most common for me is that element of anxiety. How am I going to approach this? What's going to happen? Maybe to some degree, an anger if something happens over time. And the mental part is sometimes I just continually thinking about it. And how do I get out of that loop? Now, I want us to look at these just to identify what are your tendencies when it comes to being hooked with that difficult person. Because here again, it's taking that step back to better understand myself, and then what adjustments do I need to make of myself to be able to move forward. And I don't think it's bad to have, especially those emotional feelings. They are what they are. But part of identifying those is that we don't act upon those. I don't act upon that emotion of anger. I don't act on that emotion of panic or helplessness. It's that understanding I have it. It's because this individual, for some particular reason, now what can I do to engage with that individual? So the four-prong approach to unhooking and really positions us to have, I believe, better conversations with individuals. We have to unhook physically, mentally, verbally, and unhook with a business tool when appropriate there. So let's unpack those. And Jared, you did put the handout in the chat box?
I'll drop it right now.
Yeah, why don't you drop that in? And if we could also send you the PowerPoint slides afterwards, but the handout sheet, you can kind of follow along and have a resource also for yourself. So let's begin with unhooking physically. You know, and it's probably something we all know, and it's just that reminder when we have that, we have to engage with that person or that anxiety begins to develop, it's calming yourself down and releasing that negative energy. And many times it's get up from your desk, go for a walk. You know, go outside for a walk. We kind of change the environment oftentimes before you begin to engage with that person. But what happens is we have that emotional charge and we just want to say, I want to get it done with. And we don't want to take that deep breath. We don't want to take that walk because we're hooked to that individual's behaviors. So I think it begins with that whole physical unhooking. And then the next one is mental unhooking, where you begin to assess the situation and begin to review your options. Now, both of these things are done prior to engaging with those. And I think it goes back to the results cone of better understanding what is currently driving my thinking to what behaviors I'm going to encounter. So it's that step back in me preparing to engage with them, where I can show up as the best me when we start to engage. So you see some questions there from a mental perspective is asking what's happening here. What are the facts of the situation? What are their part? What's my part? And what are my options? Because doggone it, sometimes we can get caught up in that emotion and we forget to, okay, how do I look at this objectively? How do I begin to break it down to better engage with the individual? Now, what that could look like is what's happening here. Remind myself, my coworker just snapped at me. Oh, they're always snapping at me. What are the facts of the situation? Well, what I need from them is a program report, and the individual doesn't want to provide that to me or has been putting that off. They're difficult to get things in. What's their part? They're generally moody and not very happy at the job. Everybody else avoids them. So you're not trying to label people, but you're trying to better understand the context of the situation. What's my part? I take their anger personally when they snapped at me. Well, it's not my fault that we begin to push back. It's that recognition and thinking through what are my options. And I think when we take questions like this and jot down the answers, it makes something that's a little bit more abstract in our head down into something that we can better get our hands around and to better understand. Because your thoughts ever get out ahead of you? Sometimes they can get ahead of me. And I convince myself of one thing when I may not even have proof for that. Another another, I guess, a tool that I often use with the conflict management along this same line, you're going to find on that handout on page 7. And it's how do we dig into a difficult conversation? And this is the framework that I often have people begin to package that difficult conversation. At the top, you describe the difficult person, what's happening as a part of that. And then you see the left-hand column is you. And I would have you write down, what's your emotional feelings here? What's going through internally? Why are you interested in dealing with this issue with this person? What ways have you contributed to that sometimes dysfunction or that difficulty with the person? And here again, it's not about making you or me feel guilty, but I think over time, we can contribute to our own problems. Maybe by ignoring them too long, maybe by, oh, I didn't have a good conversation the last time, I did lose my cool. So we just need to recognize where we might have contributed to it. Assumptions that we believe about the other person and about the situation, and then also what we need. So I often ask people to do it from their perspective, and then the difficult person fill out the same chart from their perspective. Now, why would I say fill this chart out from their perspective? Any thoughts? Why? They're the difficult one. So why would I ask you to kind of unpack it from their perspective? Just put something in the chat box if you.
They may think that you're the difficult person.
Yeah.
You need to see it from their perspective, how they perceive you, as well as how you perceive them.
Yeah. Rhonda, thanks for sharing that, because that is so true. That sometimes can I admit this? I can be part of the problem. And it's just recognizing, it's not to point the finger at myself, but it's to recognize, okay, I also need to see it from their perspective because they may see me as difficult. Different perspectives, Bree said, helps us understand the reason for being difficult. It's really pushing ourselves to try to see the situation from somebody else's perspective. And that helps to our whole thinking process to lead to behaviors. Because if I got tunnel vision that I'm right and they're wrong, and I jump into the conversation, it's going to be me telling them everything. But if I take that step back and try to see things from their perspective, it just gives me a little bit different understanding and ways to navigate that. Now, also remember, when we start to see things from other people's perspectives, doesn't mean we have to agree with it. And sometimes I think that's what can hold us back from trying to see things from other people's perspective, because we believe they're wrong. We believe they did something wrong or messed up. But it's not about agreeing. You're just trying to get a better feel of what they may be looking at the situation and why. And I realize we're not going to always be 100% accurate, but there again, if we don't push ourselves to see the other side, it can be so easy just to get on that tunnel vision and just drill into it, but ultimately not solve the problem. Because we can have a conversation with somebody and maybe get something in the short run, change a behavior or get a product or something, but it's not going to be sustained. It's more compliance in the moment. So it's that idea of how do we build that overall relationships that we want to move forward. And T mentioned in Crucial Conversations, we talk about pooling, shared meaning. And that's really a part of that better understanding. And then when you engage with them, you listen to what they have to say to see oftentimes how close we are. So how close we are. So here again, I think this is an excellent tool. I don't always carry the sheet around, but I also will do like a worksheet on a sheet of paper, trying to see things from both sides. And for me, it's helpful if I write it down. Because if your thinking can be so clear, convince you, but when you go to write something down at times, oh, what do I mean? What does that look like? I just think that helps move us to another step there. So those are those first two steps of physically unhooking, going for a walk, doing some stretches, get up and walk around your office to whatever that may be, and then mentally begin to prepare yourself mentally and trying to better understand the situation. And sometimes the history to it. And then we can better able to engage with them. And then the next part of that engagement looks at the verbal aspect. When we begin to speak up, we begin to share, engage in that conversation. And what we want to do is keep the overall goal in mind. And that overall goal probably has to do with change of behavior or finish something up. The goal isn't to punish somebody. It's not to punish somebody. It's not to make them feel bad. That could happen in the process, but that's not your goal. It's that idea, how do I get the things moving forward and for that person to be successful? High road of communication, be careful not to judge, be careful not to show that anger and make accusations. What happens when you feel somebody judged you? What happens when they get angry at you or make accusations? It changes your thinking to you want to defend yourself. So part of that is, how can I best engage with them? Now, this also goes back, T, a little bit to crucial conversations, this whole concept of what do I want and what don't I want? Sometimes I have to ask myself when I begin to have a conversation with somebody that's a little bit difficult in my world, I need to think about, what do I want? I may need them to change a behavior. I may need them to carry through on something. And what I don't want is, I don't want to make them matter. I don't want to make matters worse. I don't want to offend them. And I think many times when it comes to difficult conversations, we often have kind of this back and forth here. An example, I want Tom to know there's been concerns about his ability to work within his department. I don't want Tom to feel like it's a personal attack. I want Amy's reports to be done on time. I don't want to offend Amy on the quality of work that she does. So many times when we begin to engage with that individual, depending on where you're at with conflict management, depends on where you're at on your confidence of engaging, it's that element, okay, I want to change this behavior, but man, I'm scared what's going to happen. It's that unknown. But how do I begin to think about that? So you think about that difficult person and think about, what do I want and what do I not want? And there again, it often goes around those behaviors. And what happens with that behavior is, here's what I want, here's what I don't want, often leads more to an either or as opposed to a both and. Gosh, and I know that's that subtle shift. But let's think about this for a moment. It's that idea, I want Tom to know there's been concerns about his ability to work within his department, and I don't want Tom to feel like it's a personal attack. I want Amy's reports to get done on time, and I don't want to offend Amy on the quality of work she does. This is a key thing when we begin to engage in conflict conversations or with difficult people, is there's this element of behavioral change, and there's oftentimes this element of emotion. So it's not thinking about which way am I going to go? Am I going to just tell them, here's what they need to do? I'm not going to care how they feel. Or how do I try to better understand the emotion that they may be going through, and how might I adapt my approach to them? So this both and statements is really putting those together. And really where this comes into play, let's say I have to have a conversation with Jared. Jared's been this difficult person in my world, and I have to have a conversation. So I start to bring up to him, here's the behavior that I believe he needs to change. I bring that up, and what might Jared do? Does Jared want to hear that? No, Jared starts to get offended. He wants to jump in and correct me. It is at that moment, our mind often wants us to decide, are you going to jump in and fix the behavior, or are you going to back off and not offend the person? And in reality, when we begin to engage with difficult people, we have to do both. We have to do both, and that's a part of that thinking going in. I have to bring up to Jared, here's what may need to change, or here's what's difficult here. I see him get offended or get a little defensive, and I say, Jared, just hear me out. Just hear me out. Let me share my perspective, and then I will ask you for yours. So it's that idea of remembering, how do I engage? I have to do both. And that's that thinking. But if your thinking is, oh, I see the reaction, oh, I got to decide, do I just tell them what they need to do and not worry about how I deliver it? Or do I get, oh man, okay, it's not so bad, let me back off. And to me, it's almost at that split second when that begins to happen. So that either or, but trying to move it to that both and. I mean, even in some conversations, you may not even think it was difficult, but you hit a couple speed bumps there and it starts to go downhill. To say in your mind, to say, oh, time out, Jeff. How do I think about this? How do I do both to stay engaged? Acknowledging their emotion, to me, is an element of empathy. That you see that from their perspective, they're reacting differently, or they're starting to shut down. And I believe when we show up and acknowledge that, that gives a little bit more of an inroad to engage in the dialogue and the discussion. It doesn't mean they're going to enjoy having the conversation with you and I, but it's that idea of how do we stay engaged and to begin to work through it. So that both and statement to me is a key piece when it comes to verbal. Because when we start to talk with them, we're going to see a behavior and then we're going to react to it. So let's try to stay on target of really doing both. And really what we've created, to me, it's guardrails for your conversation. I want to stay focused on moving forward this way. They may try to take me on a side trip. They may want to get on some other topic that happened before, not related, but I want to let me stay here. Let's stay focused here. I want to better understand about this situation. Help me understand, what happened and why. I know this is uncomfortable, but I want to have and learn from you. So you stay engaged with that piece there. Make sense? We just see a lot of names, a few faces. So verbal, is taking the high road. And we know that that's the best road to take. But sometimes we can get caught in taking more of that low road. And here's just some examples of that. Low road, you messed up again. Oh man. High road is, how are we going to solve this problem? Low road, can't you do anything right? High road, we need a system for quality control. And when you look at this, sometimes I get feedback saying, well, you're really not addressing it. You're trying to soften the approach. I don't think we're trying to soften the approach here. I think we're trying to make it less confrontational to have the discussion. Because if I tell you messed up again, what's going to be your reaction? Yeah, you're going to want to defend. Rhonda?
Yes, I was just going to say, your anger is going to spark and it's going to start an argument.
Yeah, it's just that combat mentality that we sometimes get. But if we say, how are we going to solve this situation? Okay, obviously, they probably also know they messed up, so they don't need us telling them that. What they need from us is helping them to figure out, how do I get through it? And you see, you can still address the negative behaviors. You can still address what needs to change. But do you see how the approach is coming from a broader perspective, a broader goal that is less personal, a personal attack, or that they may feel that's happening there. And the same with the second example. You as a person of influence, you as a leader can begin to influence how that conversations goes by how you show up and what you say and how you say that. Now, hopefully you can take a look back and see, okay, unhooking from that physical perspective, from that mental perspective, helps position you to be able to engage in higher road conversations. Are you and I going to ever slip up? Yes, we probably will. But that preparation helps me prepare my thinking to be able to follow through with better behaviors to engage with that difficult person. And when it comes to engaging, it doesn't mean you're going to enjoy working with them after the conversation. It just means I can get the job done and we can get down to what needs to change as a part of that. Because a relationship still, may be a bit different, but that whole verbal piece is watch what we say. And that's where the behaviors when the thinking is broader and a better thinking process, our behaviors are also going to go more to the high road look at things. A few thoughts, I guess, to keep in mind when it comes to this. When we start to engage in that verbal conversation, first of all, there's a quote that I often use: he or she who angers you conquers you. If I get mad in a situation, gosh, that emotion's going to impact my thinking, which probably is not going to lead to the best behaviors. So just know that, yes, you may be, I guess I can still have the emotion, but I say, Jeff, take a step back and understand why I'm angry. And understand the situation as opposed to the emotion. Because when I understand what's driving it, I can often prepare myself, how do I engage with them? People who are not inclined to change their mind when they are angry. So there again, if we say something to somebody and get them more angry, or we start to accuse them of things, they get mad, and then we try to convince them to change their mind, we're just naturally going to be much less effective. So there again, it's taking that step back and thinking how we approach the situation from a more positive perspective, from that broader goal. It's not about softening it. Because some people think, okay, I just got to tell them this is what needs to change and they need to do it now. They just need to do it. Yeah, I can't argue with that. But if you told somebody like that, said it in that way, they're probably not going to change. They're angry. And that's where you can get short-term compliance, but you're not going to get long-term change. And people who are angry get defensive. And defensive people are not in a very good position to think about your ideas being good or bad. So that whole preparation and you working to take that higher road of communication is not backing down. It is that element of setting it more from a positive perspective. How do we figure this out? I can work with you. We can do this together. And do this together can be in a very professional manner. It's not so much about friends. You don't have to be best friends, but it's that element of recognizing what can I do to influence the situation. And when we think about difficult people, sometimes we have to take that step back because they've become difficult, not just overnight. They've become difficult probably over time. And we start to identify those things we may say they did to us. And that all rolls in, and we have to release some of that. And that's where I think much of this preparation can help us with that piece. And defenders don't dialogue. And what's going to be most effective with your difficult person is having a dialogue back and forth and trying to come up with, as T mentioned earlier, common understanding, common agreement then on how do we begin to move forward. But if somebody's acting from the defensive perspective, either the difficult person or me, this is not going to lead to a dialogue. We're just going to lead to sharing our own views and no gaining of understanding across and agreeing, okay, yeah, you're right. Yeah, I can acknowledge that piece there. So when it comes to that unhooking, these are just, I think, some good thoughts to keep in mind as you move forward there. Any other key thoughts you think that you have used with difficult people?
Well, I put in the chat, Jeff, that to keep in mind your nonverbal communication, because what you're not saying sometimes speaks louder than what you are saying. And we can send a very different message from what's being spoken by our body language.
Yeah, and the one thing that you often see, and some of you probably, let me just put when you think of 100% of how people are interpreting your message, if you take 100%, what I just put in the chat box was our words, our tone of voice, and your body language. How would you take 100% and break that down? How would you take 100% and break that down? Any ideas? Put some ideas in the chat box.
10% is words, 90% is the rest.
10% words, 90% the rest. Other thoughts?
I think it's 100% body language.
100% body language.
People can hear the words, but if your body is broadcasting another message,
Yeah.
they're not going to pay attention.
Yeah. Bree says 5, 10, 85. The research that was done around this is, and this is when there's more of that emotional element to the conversation, is 7% words, 38% body language, and 38% tone of voice, 55% body language. So Ron, you're right. It's that nonverbals, because you can be saying, oh, I'd like to learn more about your perspective here or why this might have happened. And you got that body language is, don't you dare say another word, which is going to win out. Yeah, it is going to be that body language or even that tone of voice as we begin to engage with those. And that tone can come in just like, oh, you want to say innocent words or innocent sentence, but you emphasize one of those words that just puts a dig into it. And sometimes we don't realize we do it because the emotion is so strong in us that it comes out as a part of our expression. So just remember, as you begin to engage, you know, a big proportion of that is on your body language. And it doesn't mean you go in there with a difficult conversation. Oh, hi, how are you? I'm just so excited to be talking with you today. You know, is that genuine? No, because you can still go in with a concern, but be careful how you're often the facial expressions. There's something that happens to the corner of my eyes and the corner of my mouth that change. And probably my wife and daughters call me out on it more than anybody at work, but I realize that, okay, how do I just try to relax that a little bit? So it's just being aware of that piece there. Any other thoughts to keep in mind from unhooking? And then the other part, kind of moving on, the last prong is a business tool, because we begin to have the conversation, and some of those conversations, how do we end it? How do we try to bring something back around to see some type of change, some type of commitment, some type of goal? And that's where we come up with the business tools. And these are described in the handout. And I'm not going to go through each one of those, but as you wrap up the conversation, what can you tie the next steps back to? How do we transfer some of that maybe into written words? Some element of commitment that we can summarize and even send back. You know, tools that we have available to us would be like job descriptions. If there's some function as a part of that, we can bring, okay, the job description says this, how we begin to move forward, expectations, goals. So you can look through elements there and how do I bring things back around to what are the next steps? Sometimes it can be dependent on the relationship that you have with that difficult person, whether it's kind of a supervisory, employee, peers. What could be a way that you begin to put some of that in writing as a follow-up? Now, part of this goes into why use these business tools. We've just got done with this difficult conversation, and we just want to say, I'm done with this. So glad, let's move on to the next thing. But what we're trying to do is loop this around to, okay, what changes are we committed to? This is what we agreed to, and putting that in an element most times in writing. If we have to come back and have the same conversation with that person again in the future, which is often the case, we start with where we ended the last time. It was, here was our agreement. Help me understand how we can continue to move forward. As opposed to going back, okay, I think we talked about this. I think we agreed with this. And you begin to go over the same parts of the conversation, the same parts of the difficulty, the same way from the previous time. So I think that's where these tools can often help us better understand, here was the commitment we talked about, or, we agreed to this, but we're not necessarily there. Help me understand. Help me understand how we might be able to move forward with that piece. Questions on the business tool? So there again, I think those 4 steps can help us to walk through and then begin to prepare and engage with the conversation. And I'm only pulling out one section of the book, Working With You Is Killing Me, but this is one of the resources I use to navigate a couple difficult work relationships in the past. So I guess I bring it to you from, it's not, I guess, guaranteed to work for everybody, but it was very useful to me. It gave me the parameters to think through the situation. It gave me the parameters. How do I begin to engage with the conversation? And as much as anything, it allowed me to unhook to a degree from the individual and look more at the behaviors. And I think that's a part of what's going to make us more effective in that piece. So if you're interested to dig deeper, that would be a great resource to utilize. I actually made my daughter in high school read this book. There were some issues she kept bringing up. I said, okay, how do you work with that person? And she actually went out and bought another copy, I think just a couple of weeks ago, to help navigate some relationships at work, because it's very applied. So I think that's a good resource for us to look at. I also want to add a couple other things here, and it's creating the win-win. And this is where we get into part of that difficult conversation. We may get into this a little bit back and forth to negotiate, how do we move forward? How do we move forward? How do we come up with a solution? How do we come up with next steps? And this win-win is kind of principled negotiations, things for you to keep in mind as you're engaging in this back and forth with this difficult person. And the 4 steps are: separate the people from the problem, focus in interests, not positions, invent options for mutual gain, and insist on objective criteria. So what does that begin to look like? The idea of separating the people from the problem is something that I mentioned earlier, is you're trying to look at the behaviors that's being displayed, not the person themselves. And because when we look at the person, it gets more of that personal, that interpersonal piece that just rubs. And if we are thinking, can take a step back and let's focus on the behaviors, how do we work through that? How do we solve the problem? That's where we understand things from their perspective, feed that in, recognize the emotion, that we don't just react to something that they do, but we think about, okay, what's causing it? What information does that give me? And how do I engage with that? And the communication, talking directly to the person, using, and you've heard that, using I versus you statements. So it's just that idea of trying to separate the person from the problem. And if that person has been difficult for a long time with us, I know it's not going to be easy. I know it's easy for me to say, but it's a commitment I think we have to make to be able to move forward with the conversation. So it's trying to remember to break that piece down. Another one we often run into is this idea of focus on the interests, not positions. And I think that's so true in today's environment. We show up to conversations, into this dialogue of how we work through things, and we want to share, this is my position, and then I listen to theirs, and it becomes like an arm wrestling back and forth, whose position is going to win. But when we unhook from that environment, we say, here's what we want to accomplish, here's the outcome we want to see. We can get the other person to also think that, then there can be more of that joint dialogue back and forth, a new understanding between you and the other person. So going into positions, if we feel ourselves just kind of butting heads, you as a person of influence can say, okay, what do we need to do different? Oh, let's take a step back. What is it that we're trying to achieve here? What's the outcome we're trying to come up with? you change the tenor of that conversation by trying to go to a little bit broader. And then, okay, how can we solve this? How can we solve this? How can we work together with that? Because I think many times the position it says here often blinds us. We get that tunnel vision. We're convinced we're right and they're wrong, and we're not going to give in. But someone is breaking that down to separate those two elements. Invent options for mutual gain, is brainstorming with the individual. What can we do? How do we move forward? How do we accomplish the bigger picture here? It can be office goals. It can be program area goals, and trying to move it to that broader piece, and then allowing yourself to have the dialogue with them. Okay, how do we make this happen? It takes it off a little bit of you versus the other person and moves it to this broader goal, what we're trying to achieve. Let's work through what are the solutions we can use to get there. And the more we can get them to engage here and for them to come up with possible solutions, I think oftentimes we're going to end up in a better place. And I'm careful, and I would caution you to be careful. Don't add too many of your ideas to begin with. Let them come up with what are some of the solutions that they see as viable ways to do it. And you listen, you begin to kind of keep track of those. Because I think many times people are still reasonable, even if they're a difficult person in our world, they often know what's that greater good. And if I can get them to commit to or bring up an option, and gosh, that's what I probably would have said, but I can go with their idea as opposed to me. It just gains a little bit more buy-in from that person. And then if I have to have another conversation with them, do you see it? Go back to, you identify this as a possible solution. We're supporting this. I understand what might have gone wrong. So it's not just you telling them, it's them identifying a reason, embracing it, and then hopefully committing to move forward. And if they don't, and oftentimes you're going to have more than one conversation with the person, but it's that idea over time they realize they're committing to it as opposed to being told to do that. And then the last one that they mentioned here is insist on some objective criteria. And that's where, if you come up with a solution on how to engage or move forward on something, it's time to think ahead of time, how are we going to evaluate what outcomes or what strategies are going to be effective? It could be numbers of clientele, it could be elements of time, it could be relationship to policies and procedures, but you try to come up with some key criteria to begin with, and then you evaluate the options back to that. Because sometimes the options can be more from an emotional perspective, more of that personal perspective. But if we can lay over top of it, here are the objective criteria that we see as most effective, we can often narrow it down, and it becomes about looking at the solutions as opposed to the back and forth, me versus them. Me versus them in that process there. So those are the 4 steps, and you might have seen those in different formats in different times, but I think when it comes to engaging with difficult individuals, these are all good reminders for us to engage and continuing to move forward with that. Let's try to see, there was a comment here I missed. How to set up the conversation. Yeah, I guess I don't have it in this presentation, but it's often to invite somebody in that I'd like to have a conversation with you about X or Y. Is there a time that we can meet and begin the dialogue with it? So part of that, and sometimes that can be difficult to reach out. They still may get defensive. Why do you need to talk to me? We're going to go through this again. But it's that idea of trying to invite them into the process, and don't just react to the emotion you see with that piece there. And part of that comes in, I have a couple, and I think the last page of the handout or one of the last pages, what happens when? And I think when they become defensive, why do people get defensive when you talk with them? Are they afraid you're going to hit them? No, probably no, hopefully not. But they get defensive because they are losing something. They're identifying maybe a weakness of them. So they're trying to protect themselves and push it back on you. And part of that is to remember when somebody gets defensive with you, when you bring things up or point things out and they get defensive, don't take it personal. It's more about them than it is about you. And that's something that I think we need to practice is as people push back, just understand defensiveness is a natural protection for people. Even when you see that look or they start to push back with that. And I think the handout just has some strategies with that, some potential language that you could use. Not you're going to memorize it, but it just gives you a background on defensiveness with that. And then there's also one that talks about being defensive more from a passive perspective. And you see the example there, you bring something up to somebody and, oh yeah, I know I did that wrong. I'll fix that. Thank you. And we think conversation's done. Well, they really were defensive, but in more of that passive way to get through the conversation. And then what you can come back and say was, okay, you recognize that you did that wrong. What will you do different the next time? What will you do different the next time? Do you see how you as a person of influence keeps going a little bit deeper with trying to come up with a resolution that is more long-term than it is short-term? So that defensiveness can be more of that overt pushing back, or that defensiveness can also look more that passive perspective. Oh yeah, I messed up. I won't do it again. But then it's, okay, what will you do different the next time? Angry or upset, it's that idea of, staying calm, let them vent, and the idea of making excuses. You see some potential language with that. Because I think sometimes with the making excuses, people will, it's almost like when they share with me, oh, that's a legit reason, the more we do across interdisciplinary, we work across offices, well, they didn't get me the stuff. Okay, I guess it wasn't your fault. But what we can go back and say is, I recognize that, but what can you do different next time to maybe reach out quicker to see if that get that information? So you can still move it a little bit more forward by acknowledging some element of the excuse is truth, but then say, what can you do the next time to prevent that? So you're moving the person more to them being more responsible, them more in control, as opposed to just pointing the finger at someone else. So there are just some common reactions, and you just see some feedback there. And wrapping up, I guess, just a couple of things on leadership skills that are critical. Just mention a few here. Fundamentally, I think it goes back to a piece of self-awareness. And that's what that unhooking physically and mentally is a lot about. The self-awareness of what I'm feeling, why, what am I going to do with that emotion? How do I engage with them in a more productive way? Because there again, the persons who we have control over is ourselves. And it's how we show up, and then they may react, or hopefully begin to react to us differently. Somebody mentioned familiar with these techniques, but my coworkers don't utilize most of these techniques. Hard to not take personal when you choose, but they don't. Yeah, personal. I still can take it. I still feel like I take it personal if somebody pushes back on something, but that awareness in me allows me to not react based on it. That awareness allows me not to act on it. And it's just kind of, okay, it's not about me. It's really more about them. And I'm not trying to pass the buck there, but yeah, that personal piece can be a real, I guess, difficult thing to deal with. And I think over time, we have to just continue to tell ourselves, It's not about me. And that's the recording to share with us. Empathy, I think you saw where we're hitting on empathy, trying to understand their perspective. And remember, you don't have to agree with it. Conflict management, I think you start to see where those things cross over, how you show up, to those difficult conversations, that elements of disagreement, how do you handle that? Be curious. And it's more about a mind, curiosity will often lead to more questions than statements. So being curious to understand why they approach something a certain way, something about that difficulty is asking more questions. Here again, be careful of the tone of voice, your body language. Questions can sometimes come as kind of an interrogation. That's not the point here. It's how do we get them to engage in the discussion? And fundamentally, forgive, heal, and try again. There have been probably people in my world over the years that I said, I am done working with them. But once I kind of walk away, get kind of cooled down, okay, no, that makes no sense, Jeff. If you want to move forward, we have to work with individuals that are even difficult in our world. So I think there's an element, I have to forgive that. But sometimes we and others may need to heal also. And what I mean by heal is moving on a little bit beyond it, better understanding it, give it some time and space. Because if you have a really difficult conversation with somebody, and they may be taking it personal, and they know they're wrong, and they know they have to change something, and you think, oh, they had a good conversation, and then they kind of ignore you for a while, and you may think, oh boy, why aren't they talking to me? They agreed that we needed to change something, but it's also them healing, giving some time and space before they can come back and really engage with you. Just don't, what I think I tell myself is don't overreact if somebody doesn't come back and talk the next day. It's an element of healing, and then try again. And try again from that perspective with that. Ron said also understand that we react to personal battles. Yeah. Things that we may not be aware of behind the scenes. Things at home, things out in the community, and sometimes things at work. It's just that be careful not to assume too much that may not understand all the pieces with that piece there. So wrapping up, I guess I hope there's some skills, some parts of the framework here that you can begin to try, some strategies, continue to add some different approaches, stay in touch with the content that we've covered, and kind of reflect, assess, and then adjust. Even as I've worked with difficult people, even as I work with some of the conflict management things, we're on a journey of personal development. So there's those pieces, we try something, it may or may not work. Okay, what could I do different the next time? Come back and adjust and keep at it. And again, as I mentioned, sometimes with difficult people, difficult situations, one conversation is not going to necessarily solve the problem. So it's looking at how you're showing up to a series of conversations so you begin to change the pattern of how that engagement happens. Begin to change the pattern of how that engagement happens. So thank you very much for allowing me to be a part of your morning here, and hopefully there's a few tips that you can take and utilize in your own discussions with those around you that may be a little bit difficult. So thank you very much.
Yep, thank you so much, Jeff. I appreciate your time, again, putting this together and presenting to us this morning. I think some other folks may have had comments. We do have a few minutes, but I did just want to call attention to the link I added in the chat, which is an evaluation, which we use also to gain topics that you might be interested in for future sessions. So please take a few minutes, give us some feedback there, and if you have future topic ideas. I'll also post here just a second our webpage for the rest of the series. Our next session is on February the 10th, and it is Dr. Shannon Washburn on brain learning. So he'll be talking about brain learning. Thanks again for being here. Please stick around if you had comments or questions. Certainly have a few more minutes to do that, and we'll catch you at the next one. Thanks, everyone.